Halito. Hello in Choctaw. Good. Been doing some upgrading over the weekend, and since it is a take-home open book midterm, there were a bunch of things that I wanted to pack into it that I hadn't done in previous years. So, and if we get to it, it might be a rough ride for some of you. So, today, but I did warn you, and I will give you fair warning. But not so much in the content, not that the content is intellectually up there, but it has an emotional impact. You can't help but do it. So, part of it is basically looking at what was happening not only after the Civil War, but in the turn of the 20th century. So, part of where we're going to go is looking at what we call intersections. There's lots of different responses to slavery and lots of different relationships that Africans in America have with the various countries that they deal with. So when we're talking about, the way we usually talk about African Americans is as if there's a border. Okay? And the way traditionally folks thought about Turtle Island, North, Central, and South America, is there wasn't a border. But people would cross the border for various reasons. And basically have to, integrate different lifestyles based on who was here. And so that means, in this particular case, with the Buffalo Soldiers, we usually think of them as an extension of the U.S. Army, but they were also a group of what we refer to in English as black Indians who would cross the border to go to Mexico because Mexico freed slaves. So understand, if you see a question on the midterm like, your classmates did last year about, which country had the first black president and which country freed the slaves first, you better answer Mexico, not the United States. Okay? So let's get that straight at the outset. And I'll give you some of the history about that. Mexico's freed the slaves first. Mexico had a black president first. That black president was a black Indian and a former slave. So he's kind of like a combination George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, except he actually freed the slaves, as Lincoln did not. Well, you already know my opinions about Lincoln, so let's get to it. All right? So one of the things that happens with the fledgling United States, even though we're expanding, when I told you about Manifest Destiny, all right? Louisiana Purchase gave us, the former French colonies. The war with Mexico gave us the West Coast, but it still isn't being settled. The war with Mexico didn't give us Oregon. So if you thought about, well, maybe you haven't thought about it, but I'll let you know, Mexico ended just south of Ashland, okay, with California. Alta California is everything above what's now the border. Baja, Lower California, is below the border, but it was all considered California because it was all Mexico, right? Because it's all those states that are now in the United States with Spanish names. That was all Mexico. Blacks were free there. And when the United States took over, or not that California becomes a slave state, but that's why that whole question about within Oregon, are we going to be a free state or a slave state? Oh, we'll be free. We'll just ban black people. So you have those interesting political mixes as part of, the country being formed. All right, so after the Civil War, and following that path indicated by manifest destiny, that it's God's will that we go from sea to shining sea, the Atlantic to the Pacific, unbroken, the United States could pursue the containment of the indigenous nations. Now, when I say containment, that's a military term, because they are free societies. Because we don't, other than a few wars, mostly with East Coast and the Seminoles, we don't have the run of Wyoming and all those other places, and especially with, the Indian wars with, Custer. Custer died for your sins. Custer wore arrow shirts, right? Indian war. So we had to, the United States had to pursue containing the indigenous nations using warfare and what I refer to as duplicitous diplomacy, which actually is a double negative, because diplomacy, it has long been stated as warfare by talking. It's warfare by talking without military force. We're going to talk it out. And case in point with this, the relations with the Native Americans were conducted as if they were separate countries, but the legal term is domestic dependent nations. That they have the legal standing of Germany, but they're within the borders of the United States and they're dependent on the United States. So it was first the War Department that dealt with Indian nations. And the War Department became the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is now part of the Department of the Interior. Okay, so wait, the War Department. So if it's war, we're still at war? Essentially we are, but the shooting's over once they surrender. Right? So divide and conquer strategy. So where we left it was T. Thomas Fortune, who wrote in 1884 Black and White, which was a post-Reconstruction analysis of denial of justice and disenfranchisement, especially land ownership and voting, which is only, basically, these are issues only if you live among white folks. So all I'm saying is there are black people that decide, okay, the United States is not for us, we're leaving. The only place you can leave is Africa, or into Indian country, or Mexico. Right? Because Lincoln wanted to send us to Costa Rica, right? Well, we don't have to go as far as Costa Rica. We could go elsewhere. But remember what I said about today, 130 million black folks in what we call Latin America. There's a historical reason for it, and this is kind of part of it. Okay? So, disenfranchisement and voting if you decide to stay in the United States. So if you go among native populations, indigenous Turtle Island was basically under attack by the War Department of the United States. Sometimes actual wars, and soon to become the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So there is a movie. Now, while I know, hate to generation gap you again, but a lot of times you get your history from movies. So there has been a movie called Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. And basically talks about the process that Dawes did among Plains Indians. And so if you understand, for example, that with European Americans, how they construct the world is by counting and measuring. So how do you decide who's in a tribe or who's not? You go there and you count who's there, right? Seems like simple. But how do you determine what race they are if they kind of look, if there's variations within black people, including naturally occurring albinos, what do you think is going to be happening with Native Americans who've been mixing with black people for up to 800 years for some folks, and within slavery? What kind of variation is there going to be? So those folks, that's a black and white photograph on the slide, right? So Do some black people have hair like that? And skin color that dark? Huh. I can think of a couple of, black actresses. Some of my favorite black actresses. Sally Richardson. She's part native. Has straight hair that didn't come necessarily, she's not a press and curl girl. So, all right. So, the Dawes rolls. Enumerated native populations, write down, count and measure them on a sheet of paper. Natives who appear too black, that's according to the white people, okay? They would have been fully accepted within the tribe, but if the white people decided that you were too dark, even though you were either full-blood native or half-native, so understand this whole full-blood, half-breed thing did not come about until white people imposed it on the tribes. Because part of the deal with the Dawes rolls was we're counting these tribal folks because we intend to take the land. Now, natives didn't believe in real estate. You don't own what you didn't create, and you didn't create the land. Humans didn't create the land. So you can use the land. It's just like the African concept. Africans didn't have real estate either. You can use as much land as you have to farm, and your family can use it, but you don't own it. All right? So natives who appeared too black were placed in the darky tent. That's literally what they called it, where all trace of their native blood, even if they're full blood or half or whatever, was bureaucratically erased. And these quote-unquote black tribal members were placed on what's called the freedmen rolls, when you've heard that phrase, because basically the United States is talking about the rights of freedmen. Okay, so now if you're a freedman, you're not technically Indian anymore, you're black. Now, I trace my Choctaw ancestry to all 8 of my great-grandparents were at least half Choctaw. At least. So I trace my lineage to one of my great-great-grandfather, George Washington, who had 10 kids. And he's on the Choctaw freedmen rolls. Now, apparently, George Washington was a favorite name among lots of black Indians in the 5 civilized tribes, and I'll define what the 5 civilized tribes are. But the 5 civilized tribes were the natives that adopted white ways, that were willing to live in square houses, do agriculture when they had to do agriculture, converted to Christianity, had syllabaries or alphabets, writing things down, and also had slaves as another piece. Now, the way they treated their slaves was without whips and chains. So basically the British and some Americans say these Indians aren't treating the slaves correctly by not beating them. And some of these, we'll get to that. Okay? So these are black Indians, or you can use the term maroon. I do. Right? So the Dawes rolls were to enumerate native tribes in order to allot up to 160 acres to each adult male. So I'm not sure if you understand how big an acre is. It's not bad. But let's say that a square mile is 625 acres, roughly. Right? So 1/6 of that, of a square mile. It's a fair piece of land, but so each adult male. Now, natives obviously didn't do land distribution like that. Okay, so the Dawes rolls will basically enumerate every member, but only give land to the males. Well, why would you do that? Well, who would do that? Right? And if they didn't do anything with the land in X amount of time, this also meant that they had to pay taxes on the land, on the allotment, or do something with it. And if they didn't, then they lost the land. Guess to who? All right? So, eliminating Indian claimants so there would be more land for whites. This meant eliminating essentially the black Indians bureaucratically. That's one agenda within that. And what happens then with this particular piece, this also led to attitudes, particularly among the 5 civilized tribes, which came to view white native mixtures over black or Mexican mixtures among such populations of the Cherokee. This has actually been studied in terms of racial attitudes. Who's the best person to marry? Well, another Cherokee. Failing another Cherokee, then another Native American. Failing marrying another Native American, then marrying a white person. And then blacks and Mexicans were considered lower on the list because it would be polluting. And that's literally a statement made in the 20th century. Okay, so where did they get those ideas? So when I talk to you about mimetics, viruses of the mind, and racism being one of them, wow, that's definitely being spread. And the only way that you can resist it is to either go back to an older, stronger, more successful meme or fighting it more contemporarily. So one of the things that also happened among, for example, the Cherokee fought on the side of the Confederacy to preserve their slaves, even though their slaves were in chains. But when they lost, part of the terms of surrender is that their black freedmen be full Cherokee citizens. And they did function as such up until a recent vote in the last decade or so. And then you also saw other of the 5 civilized tribes vote to expel their black tribal members and leave the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Indians on the tribal rolls. Big, relative controversy, right? So there were other folks outside of the 5 civilized tribes, but the Seminoles were considered the 5 civilized tribes. People like John Horse, or also known by Spanish Nom de Guerre, Juan Caballero, who traveled back and forth as indigenous people crossed the border to Mexico, fought against the United States and sometimes the Mexican government, but basically could find shelter within Mexico. So, once the war is over, in addition to rebuilding of original creation of an African-American identity, in a monolingual, that is English only, but of course, black Indians who travel across the border, of course, had to be bilingual too, especially if they were going to establish either colonies or communities, right? So converted to Christian, but an activist liberation theology focused on community organizing and uplift. Many others are practicing other Abrahamic religions or not, but the U.S. is free to attack Indian nations. And why? For example, civil war naturally did nothing to eliminate white supremacy or sexism or any of the other isms. The Indian nations, besides occupying land, represent a visible cultural threat to the growing United States, which relied heavily on maintaining inequality. Because I pondered this. Why attack? What are the natives doing to you? Just, we hadn't discovered oil or uranium or natural gas, which is another reason to rip off people, and a controversy today that we'll talk about next term. Okay? The Indian nations thrived without taxes, without real estate, without racial or gender prejudice, and were independent of the need for trading with the United States. Legally, they're called domestic dependent nations, but they weren't dependent until their capacity to thrive culturally was destroyed in wartime. Okay? Such trade usually proved to be unequal at best, trading in goods rather than, say, peaceful cultural technologies. Which is not to say that in Indian country we should go back to living in teepees, those of us who lived in teepees, but in terms of adapting to the 21st century, what does it mean to be native? I could, because I have a grandfather on the Freedom Rolls, apply for citizenship within the Choctaws if I want to do that. But I consider it a game, personally. An oppression. You're going to rely on the United States government for your identity? Really? No. So as an example, Buffalo Soldiers, Bob Marley notwithstanding, you can see the demographic there. And I started with, and I gave you two links. This is in an Afro-Mexican website. Point must be made here that is the fact that the black population in the early colony was, that we're talking about Mexico when it was a colony of Spain, was far larger than that of the Spanish. In 1570, we see the black population is about 3 times that of the Spanish. In 1646, about 2.5 times. And in 1742, blacks still outnumber the Spanish. It's not till 1810 that Spanish are more numerous. So what does that tell you? Afro-Mexicans, both slave and free, participated in various kinds of labor in Mexico. The majority worked in either the silver mine, and large numbers worked in urban centers, largely as domestic workers. For example, having a black servant or maid was quite the status symbol for elites. Okay, some things never change. Also, in urban centers, blacks, both slave and free, worked as artisans, peddlers, craftsmen. Africans were deployed in rural coastal areas, such as Veracruz, Gulf of Mexico, and what are now the states of Guerrero and Oaxaca on the Pacific. And free blacks, because there were free blacks, not just slaves, participated in large numbers in military service during the colonial period. In Veracruz, black slaves were used primarily in the labor-intensive sugar industry. So you have to understand, sugar was oil in this time. Okay? Europe, you could basically find a recipe for rabbit, a French recipe for rabbit, and the only thing that came from France was the rabbit. Sugar, salt, other spices came from Africa, Asia, China. I mean, Marco Polo brought Chinese noodle technology to Italy. So if you think about Italians and pasta, they didn't get that. They didn't develop that on their own. That came from China. And the spices to spice tomatoes came from here. Peppers came from here. So when you're talking about sugar and salt, those became big money makers, and those were means of power in Europe. So sugar was real big. Gold and silver naturally were also very big. So the intensive sugar industry of Chilapa, which is how you pronounce that, the X is she. Late 16th and early mid-17th century, we're working sugar processing, canes. African slaves were imported specifically to replace Indian laborers because we had a higher resistance to disease brought by Europeans. So we'd known Europeans before they got here. So anyway, the Pacific coastal plain, blacks would work mainly as ranchers and cowboys. In fact, our whole west, I think I might have mentioned the whole western writing thing basically came from the Spanish, and particularly the Moors. They referred to themselves as vaqueros, which equals cattle men. In Texas, they were referred to, these black vaqueros were referred to as cowboys, not giving them the respect of calling them men, and the title stuck. So it was originally an ethnic slur that is now, well, you know what the image of what a cowboy is in America. Django notwithstanding. All right. So the 1889 photograph of Buffalo Soldier Scouts includes then employed and retired members of the Seminole Black Indian Nation, large number of whom worked for the Army after being employed by the Mexican Army. So, remember, of course, they're working in the Mexican Army as well. Vicente Guerrero was himself a slave and actually freed slaves and promoted some sort of equality before he was assassinated. So, Africans had escaped in Indian country, northwest and south. Seminoles were originally from Florida, where they were a branch of the Creek Nation, distinguished from other Creeks in their acceptance of runaway slaves who had toiled in the former British colony that became the United States. They're accepted and willing to fight alongside the Seminoles first against the Spanish and then the British. And one of the reasons that the British opposed Africans and Indians getting together, the example of the Maroons of Jamaica and Florida, and this is also when Samuel Thurston was basically speaking against the blacks, have a long history of understanding white culture. These are the specific historic examples that he was talking about. Now, obviously in Florida and Jamaica, there's more than 200 blacks to actually organize the natives, right? Only 200 blacks here in Oregon. They're not going, and only less than a handful had any contact with Native Americans at all. And they were basically pro-America in terms of bringing in wagon trains and establishing businesses. So the initial blacks were bound to work for the Seminoles in a relationship that was described as slavery without whips, chains, and with the right of the bondspeople to farm their own land. So that's definitely not slavery as it was in the United States. By the time of the Second Seminole War, where the United States tried to conquer the Seminoles, they were a largely mixed-race nation with those of African heritage taking many important decision-making positions, like John Horse. So Dembo Factor, one of the black Seminoles who fought in that war, is in the above photo. He's the elderly gentleman with the white beard. There. So after fighting in the Seminole Wars, okay, we lost, no hard feelings. We'll be part of the U.S. Army now, since we're here. And they still get dissed, naturally. Okay, so they left to settle in the Indian Territory of Oklahoma. They were harassed by other Indian nations of the territory who considered the Seminoles to be blacks and subject to capture and sale to whites. So a troubling history in Indian country. Okay, same thing happened with the Wampanoags and the Pequots. The Wampanoags and the Pequots were nations that also had heavy influences by African Americans and who basically became part of the tribe. The Wampanoags were the folks that greeted the Pilgrims. The Pequots were the creators of wampum, and they remain one of the largest, well, let's put it this way. The Pequots own the third largest casino on the planet. Foxwoods in around Mystic, Connecticut. And they were also kind of like the Federal Reserve Bank of Indian country because they're the makers of wampum. Okay, so they had black, native, and some white tribal members that mixed. And they were all, the Pequots were conquered and put into slavery. So Seminoles began exploring the Mexico-Tejas border with the hope of resettling in Mexico where slavery had been abolished. First efforts of them to resettle were unsuccessful. The Mexican-Texas border was controlled by the natives of the area, the Comanches, who were opposed to all outsiders. Seminoles developed methods of fighting off the Comanches, and settlements were created in the Mexican state of Coahuila. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but President Comonfort hired Seminole fighters to protect Coahuila and other border areas from the Comanches, and also from the raids by white outlaws from the United States. So, hence, the natives, when they were fighting for the U.S. Army, gave them the respectful name of Buffalo Soldiers, not only because of our hairstyle, but also because of our fighting ability, and buffalo were considered sacred, too. So, black Seminoles continued to live along the Rio Grande. Notable Seminole town in Coahuila is named Nacimiento de los Negros. And then you can go to the National Park Service version of this, which is basically the Presidio. It's the site of Presidio website, where some Buffalo Soldiers are buried. All right. So, blacks and Indians. Now, this is dot Indians, not feather Indians, since we're using the distinction. Don't mean to be flippant, but introducing a word to you, satyagraha. Satyagraha literally means, it's a Sanskrit word. It means, sat means truth, satyagraha means holding on to truth. So, as Gandhi said, its root meaning is holding on to truth, hence truth force. I've also called it love force or soul force. So when you hear Martin Luther King talk about soul force, this is the lineage that he's talking about. Now, last week I told you about, black people have been trying to, okay, how do we deal with racist America in a nonviolent way? Yeah, we have Buffalo Soldiers, but we just fought a war. Obviously, warfare ain't going to be doing it because we don't have sufficient numbers to win that way. So how are we going to do that? So, Du Bois's attempts to bring Gandhi to America failed. Gandhi sent over a message, but a number of black people decide, okay, Gandhi can't come to us, we'll go to Gandhi. And they do. But just to start with Gandhi, in the application of satyagraha, I discovered in the earliest stages that pursuit of truth did not admit of violence being inflicted on one's opponent, but the opponent must be weaned from error by patience and sympathy. Now, this is not easy. If you get struck on your cheek, it is human to basically do a back fist, not turn the other cheek. In any case, in love your enemies, that's not what Yeshua was suggesting in any case. Love your enemy means that you know your enemy to the degree that you know your enemy better than your enemy knows themselves. So that if they're about to strike you on the cheek, you're just not there. Missed. Try again. It's not going to work for you. For what appears to be truth to the one may appear to be error to the other, and patience means self-suffering. So the doctrine came to mean vindication of truth, not by infliction of suffering on the opponent, but on oneself. Not meaning you're torturing yourself. Meaning, I'm going to stay and teach you whether you want to learn or not until you get it. Because you ain't taking away my peace or my wisdom. This is not an easy position to take at all. So it's forgive them for they know not what they do. So it's not just in Hindu scripture, but also Christian. But it's also indigenous too. So indigenous satyagrahic, which is a made-up word, but So the idea is very similar to Atlantean democracy, which is kind of where Atlantean democracy came from. The idea is every human being is a relative and a citizen. Poverty is violence. Native people didn't believe in poverty. I don't know, how many of you read the newspaper? Sports section. Okay. There was a piece, really good piece in Sunday's paper about this guy, a local guy who was homeless for 5 years, and he wrote a book on it. He's off the street now. But he said, went through a divorce, had 2 kids, had to pay child support. Child support took all of my check, but $2. So I basically, went on essentially a death spiral, lost my job, and then every once in a while I get arrested and they would put me in jail for 4 months because I didn't pay child support, which I couldn't pay child support because I didn't have a job. I'm not sure how jail cures that. Right. And so so he basically talked about how he flew signer on in Springfield at the corner where the McDonald's is on like 52nd on Main, and lived in the woods and all that kind of stuff. And so poverty is violence. Poverty is not. So the fact that you can actually have somebody be homeless because they don't have a job, because they didn't do anything on their own. They were basically doing, this was a prosperous person, a productive person, just fell on hard times. So every human being clothed, fed, sheltered, educated to the level necessary to be a spiritually, culturally, politically, economically, creatively, and viable contributor to society. But you don't go homeless because you ain't got no job. We didn't play that here before a certain time. Okay? And humans live in such a way to not cause extinction of biosphere critical species. And how do you know whether a species is biosphere critical? You don't. I'm not sure what the use is of mosquitoes and ticks, but they may form some thing. Blackberries, I'm not sure about either, but okay. But ecocide is violence. So humans live in such a way that the same resources available now are available as long as the grass grows and the river flows, which is the actual phrase that English-speaking people translated as the 7th generation. So, which is longer? Which would be the shorter period? Grass grows, a river flows until they stop doing that, or 7 generations? It's easier for people to conceive of 140 years. So, but that's the idea. Indigenous satyagraha, holding on to truth. So, African Americans know and remember suffering out loud to eliminate and end the suffering. That's part of satyagraha, holding on to truth. The purpose for talking about past discrimination is that it's not past. It's still happening. But certain people don't want to believe it. And basically, having been shown, don't necessarily want to take action to relieve suffering, because their power, relatively speaking, privilege, shield them from seeing suffering. Now, we all have power and privilege in some area, and I should maybe even hand out a sheet so that you could do your own analysis of that. But our strength is to tell the truth, whether it's believed or not. As Yeshua said, those who have ears to hear, let them hear it. But if they don't, they don't. But part of satyagraha is to keep telling them in a way that they hear it, whether they get it or not. So, as an example then, the question is how to practically and peacefully change and transform racist America. So, Du Bois So America is not just simply racist, but also anthropocentric, that is, centered on humans, or male humans. Classist, sexist, heterosexist, but we'll take those in turn. Problem W.E.B. Du Bois felt was how to bring a proponent of nonviolent change to America. So that was Gandhi. So to use, how many of you have seen Star Wars? How many of you have peeped Wikipedia? I'm not making this up. All right? So, the civil rights Star Wars analogy. So you've seen all 6 episodes, right? Of Star Wars? Okay, all right. So here's the analogy. Gandhi is Encada del Gormo. I'll show you who that is in a second. Martin Luther King is Obi-Wan Kenobi, killed by Darth America. Bayard Rustin is Qui-Gon Jinn, right? Who was Obi-Wan Kenobi's teacher. And his teacher was Yoda. So Howard Thurman is Yoda. So who is Yoda's teacher? Right, but you have to go to Wikipedia to get that. But you can Google Yoda's teacher, and it'll go take you to Wikipedia. I'm not making it up. Right? Somebody created a backstory, Encada del Gormo. So Gandhi is de Gormo. In other words, the hidden teacher of a particular lineage. So everybody understands, oh, Martin Luther King is following Gandhi, but Martin Luther King never met Gandhi. How does he know how to practice satyagraha? In fact, if you've never even heard the word satyagraha as part of Martin's teachings, like, well, why is that? Where did this come from? Gandhi. Oh, yeah. Gandhi? Why Gandhi? Okay? So Gandhi couldn't come to America, so Americans went to Gandhi, and Howard Thurman was one of them. How many have heard of Howard Thurman? So this is the first time you're hearing about Howard Thurman. Okay. It's all right. You knew you were getting a secret backstory, right? It's not exactly a secret. So, he's the hidden teacher for the public activist Martin Luther King. And he actually survived Martin Luther King. He didn't die till the 80s. Wrote lots of books. And if you study his books, his teachings, it's clear who's the master and who's the student by comparing writing styles. So he writes from a Christian perspective that the reason you are nonviolent is that if you kill your opponent, you forever remove the possibility that your opponent will achieve liberation in his lifetime. He actually explicitly says that, which is like so deep that's Buddhist. This lifetime? This is why you're nonviolent? Like to a Klansman? And he's basically talking about his experience in growing up in the South around this time, because he was born in the time period that we're talking about, the turn of the century in Florida. So how do you do that, Howard? I want to know. But Yoda says,
fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to the dark side.
So the anger comes from actual experiences. You know, Howard writes in one of his books. I have about 3 or 4 favorite books of his. One of them is called Disciplines of the Spirit. There's a whole chapter on suffering, because suffering is one of the disciplines of the Spirit. And he talks about his experience raking leaves in Florida and for this little girl's father, and she keeps kicking the pile of leaves, scattering them as he rakes them up. And so he threatens to tell her father on her. She goes into the house and comes back with a pin and starts sticking him with the pin. And he goes, ow, stop. And she goes, you can't feel pain. Not really. Right? And that was what he's describing is a popular view at the time, that because blacks were inferior, they couldn't feel pain because they were less evolved. So what she was believing is, yeah, well, you're not really a person. And so he's right. He's inciting this incident. He said, well, of course I'm a person, and of course I feel pain, but she was taught not to see it in others. Okay, so in one sense that's my problem, but in another sense I have to reach out to her to show her the error of her ways, because he's writing this now as an adult, not as the teenager that was having the pain inflicted on him. So in a piece called, well, the book is called The Luminous Darkness, he writes about the spiritual effects of segregation on the black soul and the white soul. So, you know, Du Bois, because he's a contemporary of Du Bois. So all these black intellectuals are, of course, reading each other and cross-pollinating. So you notice that Du Bois wrote about the soul of black folks, an entire book, entire small pamphlet. He also, as a piece of satire, writes about the soul of white folks. Well, Howard is taking this deeper into Satyagraha by saying the spiritual effects of segregation on the black soul and on the white soul causes us to lie to whites about the pain of segregation in order to survive, and to seek healing on our own while allowing their souls to continue to decay. So when I drew, for example, the ivory tower, right? And we live in the shadow of the ivory tower. And in segregation, we have to create our own space to warm us against the chill of being in the shadow. Howard says this is a natural thing to do, to create your own sanctuary where there is no sanctuary. Create your own healing when you're being oppressed. It's natural to do that, and right and proper. But if you stay in that space and achieve your own liberation, and your oppressors are still bound, so you have to free them, because otherwise, if you don't, that's that's worse violence than what they're doing to you. Because what they're doing to you is only physical. This is coming from a spiritual point of view, and he's talking about, all right, if we're talking about the soul, we're talking about more than just the body that you're in. Right? So, from the point of view of Satyagraha, it's doing violence to actually not to be silent. To speak up means that they might kill you. Oh well. Why are you afraid of death exactly? You don't have to answer that, but. All right? So, to test our Jedi powers would be, so Kush and Indus Kush, that is Africa and India, are the sources of our strength. America is the test of our strength. So to test our Jedi powers would be the United Siths of America. Okay? While with their white supremacist Sith mind tricks, the simplest, say that three times really fast. The simplest one is to reduce a complexity to a label or a stereotype. And then provoke and disturb your inner peace that you found in your sanctuary. Yea, verily, they did text and vex with extreme provocation. So I'm about to show you some extreme provocation, so the intensity is going to go up from here. To understand where the context of the civil rights movement came from. Okay, in India, basically the British massacred people in front of a temple. Actually, a Sikh temple. in the town that holds the largest Sikh temple. Shooting by the army. Interesting parallels between the British and the Americans. So, in response to someone that didn't necessarily understand that Jim Crow wasn't an actual person, very common mistake. I made it when I was 7. We're driving down to Disneyland, and we're driving through Torrance for some reason, and Torrance was a part of Los Angeles